Next, we have the presentation and update of the Burien 2044 Comprehensive Plan. And that goes to Susan McLean and Lisa Gruder.
Hello, members of council. Hi, members of the public, staff, city manager. The purpose, we're going to be briefing you on Burien 24, the city's comprehensive plan. The Burien 24 actually refers to our major or periodic update, which provides an update for how the city will grow and change between now and the year 2044. This is an activity, this major update or periodic update will be required every 10 years from here forward. So it's a pretty big deal for the city because it does set goals and policies for how the city will change and grow, accommodate more people and different kinds of activities as we grow within a growing region. So tonight we're going to be highlighting a few different aspects of the plan. We're going to be talking about some of our climate work. We're going to be talking about some of our housing work, in particular middle housing. We're also going to be talking about sort of what's kind of has traditionally been core to comprehensive plans, which is the sort of concept for how we are going to identify zoning for future years. So the future land use map, which talks about the intensity of growth and development, where different activities will take place. So that'll be our last major topic. We're hoping to pause between those topics to allow for some comment or questions from members of council. I wanted to mention also that we're coordinating and collaborating with all other departments of the city. We're doing a lot of additional outreach in addition to some of the high level stuff that we're going to be presenting. We are working closely with economic development on an economic development strategy and then zoning in the urban center and throughout the city to enhance jobs and more businesses and that kind of thing. We're also adding a human service element and a few other new kind of concepts that will be featured in this plan that we haven't seen in the past. So I wanted to introduce Lisa Gruder with Burke Consulting. She's a fantastic thinker on comprehensive planning. She has a team here as well, and I'm going to be turning the presentation over to her from here forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, members of the council. I'm Lisa Gruder, principal with Burke Consulting. I'm joined this evening by Ben Silver, a senior associate, and Kamel Raslin, an associate with Burke, and I believe there they are, they're promoted. So we're going to cover, if we can advance to the next slide, please. We're going to cover just some background information. Some of the key grants that the city received from the Department of Commerce and the outcome of those for missing middle and climate resilience. We'll touch lightly on vision and values, which has been part of our engagement effort with the community. And then we're going to speak to the land use alternatives and then next steps. So we could go to the next slide, please. And one more. This just gives you a sense of how the Burien Comprehensive Plan sits within the state and regional framework. So we have the Growth Management Act that sets the overall goals and requirements for the comprehensive plan, and Vision 2050, which is the regional 4-county plan with the Puget Sound Regional Council, provides guidance across those 4 counties. And the countywide planning policies for King County, and then Burien. So Burien's plan is responding to all of those new policies, and the city has that responsibility to respond to those policies as well as its own needs. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is just a graphic illustrating that the comprehensive plan is an overall umbrella and sets the overall direction, goals, and policies. And underneath that, we have more detailed system plans like for transportation, for parks. We have the development code, and we have other programs that are responding to that overall umbrella. Next slide, please. This slide is trying to show what some of that regional responsibility is to growth. Burien is one of 16 core cities in the region and has a share of growth to take. That includes another 7,500 dwelling units between 2019 and 2044. That also includes an emergency bed allocation. That's the first time that that's been done in the region, and it's proportional to your housing allocation. And then the jobs target is another 4770 jobs. So as we're putting together the updated plan, we need to show how the city can accommodate that growth. The other new aspect to these growth numbers are that the city needs to show that it can provide housing at different income levels. So that's a new element that we spent some time on. Next slide, please. So we've been going through a few stages of this process. You may recall last fall, we did a visioning effort with the community, and there were a number of events asking what the future of Burien should be for 2044. And then this spring, we brought back some ideas and we asked for people's stories around housing and parks and transportation and strategies, their preferences for strategies. And then now we're entering a phase of putting together that draft plan that's based on that vision and some of those stories and strategies. And we'll be coming out this fall with the draft plan, and there'll be more engagement there. And then it'll turn into more of a legislative process next year. The Planning Commission and City Council will take it up. Throughout this process, we've had an advisory committee that's made up of different members of different city commissions who are helping us formulate the plan. Next slide, please. So we're going to cover some highlights of some of the major grants and initiatives, the Middle Housing first, and then the Climate Resilience Grant. So if we could go to the next slide. For the Middle Housing Grant, we had sort of two major aspects to it. One was to respond to a new aspect of growth management, which was to look at racially disparate impacts of past planning decisions, particularly around housing, and then how the city could provide for middle housing in single family areas. Those were the two major aspects. The city did an analysis of policies and code and zoning code. As well, the city did engage with community-based organizations to do outreach, and part of those stories were part of our stories and strategies that we conducted in the spring. So we're going to first talk a little bit about the evaluation. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we've been finding, which is not unusual in the state of Washington, is that communities of color have lower rates of homeownership compared to white residents. The poverty rates tend to be higher. The home ownership and rental costs tend to be higher. Those groups tend to have longer commutes, and there can be more evictions. So the graph on the right is showing you the home ownership rates that illustrate one of those points, with white households having greater access to home ownership than other groups. I'm going to ask Kamel to join me and share some of the next few slides with some other points of our evaluation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you to the council. Are folks able to hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Lisa spoke to, as part of the Middle Housing Grant, displacement and exclusion from certain types of housing or affordable housing were evaluated. So certain things like eviction, demolitions, redevelopment, and rising prices threaten Burien's history as a relatively affordable place and as a vibrant community. You can move on to the next slide, please. As part of this, we created maps to highlight the displacement risk within Burien based on a number of factors such as social vulnerability, increasing gentrification, and accelerating housing costs. We created an index of displacement risk based on these factors. As you can see, there are very few parts of Burien that are at low displacement risk, just some coastal areas in South Burien. And we can move on to the next slide. Aside from the displacement risk index, a policy evaluation on land use and housing was also conducted. On the left, we can see some of the different questions that were asked during this evaluation as they relate to land use policies. Certain things like, has the policy been effective in accommodating more housing, or does it increase displacement risk or worsen displacement? Things like that were asked about each of the policies, and different recommendations were given, as we can see on the right. With that, I believe I'm passing it back to Lisa to discuss zone.
Thank you, Kamel. So one of the areas, both in policy and in terms of the plan map that we saw could use a review was our single family areas. Burien overall is more diverse than the county across a number of racial groups. But in terms of zoning, it's less diverse in parts of Burien. And so one of the aspects of the grant and one of the things that were passed in the Growth Management Act was to take a look at different housing types that could be a fit in the single family areas. And that was the other part of our analysis. So if we could go to the next slide. What we're speaking to in terms of potential housing types in the single family areas are accessory dwelling units, which you have started to allow more recently in the last few years. There are others like duplex, triplex, or townhomes, cottages, different kinds of small apartments that could be a fit in different single family areas. And that could allow for greater opportunity for home ownership and other access to housing. So if we go to the next slide, the map on the left is showing where the single family districts are in yellow. And the map on the right is showing where those different housing types I just referenced, the townhomes, the cottages, the duplex, triplex, where those are allowed today is a much smaller area of Burien. So what we were taking a look at is how might we integrate those different housing types into single family areas. And on the next slide, we've started to outline what different zones could look like. The one on the left is called R1, and that would be like a small lot, single family, and R2 might be duplex, triplex, and small units, and R3 might be those small apartments that might be a good fit, for example, on corners. We're contrasting that with, on the right, R4 and R5 are some of the zones that were looked at in Ambon Boulevard Park along particular corridors. What we're speaking to are the sort of more gentle density in the single family areas. So that's part of our work program as we move forward. We're also responding, if we go to the next slide, in addition to the grant, which asked the city to look at racially disparate impacts and how to integrate missing middle, we're responding to laws that changed as recently as in April and took effect this summer. HB 1337 for accessory dwelling units on the left requires allowing 2 accessory dwelling units in all single family districts. And you have done so for a little while, but there are some provisions we need to take a closer look at. You must allow detached accessory units. You have to allow units at least 1,000 square feet in size. Impact fees where you have them can't exceed 50% of the primary unit. You must allow sale as condominiums, and you may not require owner occupancy. So that's HB 1337. On the right-hand side is HB 1110, which requires allowing middle housing. And there's a chart there, and you're kind of in the middle in terms of the size of the community being between 25,000 and 75,000 residents. In this bill, the base requirement is to allow at least 2 dwelling units per single family lot, up to 4 units per lot if you're within a quarter mile of frequent transit, or if somebody's providing an affordable unit. An alternative to that set of requirements is to implement middle housing density on at least 75% of single family lots. And so there's other provisions in there. So the city, by doing the work in the grant, was kind of set up fairly well for these new housing bills that came in that are giving us more specific direction that we will be taking a look at in the plan. So I'm going to pause there on that slide before we move on, just to see if there's questions on the middle housing before we go into climate.
Thank you for this work. This is obviously extremely important for Burien and our growth and our attempts to build more housing like every community. But are we able to move up the implementation of House Bill 1110? Because we've discussed how the legislature set the parameter that it needs to be included in by 2025. But is there a way to move it up for us so that we start a change of zoning and codes for next year?
I think our team has been working closely with city staff on the code elements, and depending on the schedule that you have with your planning commission and the council, it could be done together by the end of 2024, which is about when we're thinking the plan would come forward.
Okay, gotcha. So pretty much anyway, the timeline would be pretty close to being the same. Okay. And then a follow-up question really quick. And you might get to this, but as far as federal assistance goes, like the YIMBY Act, are we able to take advantage of some options there to create some more incentives for builders to build more of these styles of housing that we need?
I'll see if Susan has a comment on that particular federal law, but one thing that we have been doing as part of the economic development strategy is interviewing developers about what are some barriers to producing some of these housing types, and taking a closer look at that, and that may form the basis for some incentives. I don't know if you
Would love to hear what they've said too, by the way.
Yeah, we'll report back on that. Yeah, I think a big part of what we're doing is really looking at what is feasible in what situations. We're already getting some feedback on some development standards that we have that we probably want to take a look at. Some of them include simple things like how much land do we set aside for setbacks between properties, for example, or what are the parking requirements per lot. And our Ambon Boulevard Park kind of got us partway there when we started looking at TOD or areas that are within walking distance of high capacity transit. So we're going to be looking at development standards that are going to be and asking ourselves and asking developers what is feasible, what are some things that we need to change to make different housing types more affordable to build and then more affordable to occupy as well.
Right. Okay.
So,
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for the this part of the presentation, and I may have questions about the climate one as well. But as we talk about the city growing, we have all these other agencies that we work with, the fire and the utilities and schools and all these other districts that overlap with us. Are we working in tandem with them? Do they have their own comprehensive plans for 2020 or 2044? How does that all intermesh with each other?
They respond to different kind of mandates as to what plans they produce and what timelines, but the city does coordinate with them. And we have, for example, through the State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA, the city put out a scoping notice and sent notice to all the agencies about that. And I know the city has had some meetings with some of the districts. I think, Susan, you can comment more on those.
yeah, we typically, in fact, we just reviewed a couple of comprehensive plans. One was Water District 20, but basically we periodically review their comprehensive plans and we ask them to review ours as well. Some of the timing is a little bit different. So we take a look at what are our growth projections and we share those. And then we look at their plans too, to make sure that they're consistent with what we're planning as well.
Can I ask one more question?
Go ahead.
I wanted to also ask about the affordability. I saw that there were two kinds of 0 to 30. One was permanent supportive and the other just wasn't. And I wanted to know what that larger group of housing, what the how it was kept affordable and what it potentially would look like.
I think aside from permanent supportive housing, the PSH units, it could be subsidized units affordable to seniors or other qualified groups. It would be hard to think that income level would be produced on the market. So it's typically a subsidized type of unit.
Councilmember Garcia.
Thank you very much for the update. This is really important work, so thank you. More of a question / comment or maybe request. The question is very follow-up on the one by Councilmember Sarah Moore. Do this school district, they get their own comprehensive plans, and are we doing the same thing? Don't want to make assumptions, but we are. Okay. And then the other comment, I guess, is I think we're all really excited to take advantage of this. Obviously, I think you'll find a lot of the council members are supportive of the missing middle. One thing I think it's going to be important though for us is to make sure that we have the resources to build these houses eventually whenever the private market starts. So I guess to look into what type of staffing levels do our permitting department need to be at in order to take on a potential increase of missing middle applications for building if we're going to make changes to say in the next 20 years, we really want to be the leading and start now. I think it's really important to make sure that we are aware of what we need in the permitting department to process these applications, because we can change the menu and put in this really new exciting dish as much as we all want. But if we don't have the actual staffing to produce it in the kitchen, we won't be able to actually do good work. So I guess just to focus on the implementation part that was asked, how can that be done? So with the staffing on the permitting process.
And I thank you for that, that comment. That's very true. And I think that'll lead to the next conversation that you'll be having with Matthew Hobson and Eric Christensen about some of our finances. So thank you.
If you're willing, we can go on to the climate portion of our presentation. I'm going to give some introduction and then Ben's going to join me for some of our work. First of all, the city has a great foundation. You adopted a climate action plan in 2021, and it focuses primarily on greenhouse gas reduction and different ways that the community could help achieve that. The city received a grant under the Department of Commerce to consider climate vulnerability, which would be more the adaptation side of things. And also in April, the state passed House Bill 1181, now requiring a climate change element, both for greenhouse gas mitigation and for climate resiliency. And so with that grant, we've been able to produce some information that'll help fold that into the comprehensive plan. And Burien, like the rest of the region, is experiencing extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and the effects of regional fires and smoke. And so this is timely to put into a long-range plan. So if we could go to the next slide, the grant had three aspects to it. One was a climate vulnerability index, which Ben will speak to. The other was a climate vulnerability assessment, and both those things led to some ideas for strategies and policies. So we go to the next slide. I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the council for having me. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to speak about the Climate Vulnerability Index. This is a planning tool to help understand how climate vulnerability varies across the city. An index, similar to the Consumer Price Index or the Body Mass Index, it's a way to bring together and compare dissimilar data. So data that might be a different metric, but both are inputs to understand climate vulnerability. The Climate Vulnerability Index for Burien combines over 30 indicators around climate stressors, demographics, community health, environmental critical areas, and other. And we group those into exposures, sensitivities, and adaptive capacities. And what those are is exposure. Those are the types of climate stressors. Those are how the climate might be changing and where that might be felt. Sensitivity are those things inherent in a place or system that predispose something to be more sensitive to those changes. And adaptive capacities are those things that might be social or socioeconomic characteristics that predispose a place or population to have a lower capacity to adapt to those impacts. And we sum all these indicators together in these three categories. We bring the three categories together, and that forms our basis for climate vulnerability. It's a relative look. We're not saying how Burien compares to the rest of the region. What we are saying is, how does Burien compare to other areas of itself when we look at these metrics? So we'll go to the next slide, please. This is the indicator list. I'm not going to go through all of these in depth, but show what we're thinking about. With exposures, we did some sea level rise modeling. We also looked at extreme heat and flood exposure and precipitation exposure. For sensitivity, again, these are those things that are inherent in a place, things that might predispose somebody to higher sensitivity to climate change. Age is often one of them, being older or younger, proximity to certain environmental hazards, as well as different health metrics we've seen in the literature that are associated with increased sensitivity to climate change. And then adaptive capacity, again, are these socioeconomic, demographic, might be location-based attributes that predispose a place to lower adaptive capacity. And you can see how some of these, while they might change in the long term, they are things that policy options might be able to help mitigate. Limited English households and people living alone, there are different outreach strategies to potentially reach those people and inform them of climate events or how to respond to extreme climate events. Other things like low tree canopy cover and the urban heat island were also considered. We'll go to the next slide and show a couple of these maps. I'll preface this by saying we have a web tool in which you can go and explore all this data, because I know the scale is pretty high level here, but that will be available to you if it's not already. So on the left, we're just showing how we start to build up some of these indicators, looking at the intersection of high urban heat island, which is the darker orange areas, and then the tree canopy coverage in the city, which are the green areas. And then on the right, we have sea level rise. Again, the scale is a little tough here, but on the online map, you'll be able to zoom in and see those areas where there's sea level rise. And we modeled this based on inputs from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. Go to the next slide, please. So this really shows how we start to build up the overall index. Again, we take these dissimilar data and we standardize them. So we really create an apples to apples comparison between the different data points. Grouped into these subcategories, we then create a subscore. So there's a sub-index each for exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. In all these maps, the darker areas are areas that, will contribute to higher vulnerability. If we think of this like a Venn diagram, the areas where higher exposure and higher sensitivity and lower adaptive capacity all overlap in the middle are those areas of higher vulnerability, and the areas that we want to take a look at and understand more what's going on there. The next slide, please. So there are a couple ways of looking at this. On the left-hand side, we have the overall climate vulnerability index. This is that Venn diagram look of where the areas that are more vulnerable. Again, I want to stress that it's relative to different areas of the city and not a regional comparison. There are other great tools for regional comparisons that exist out there. And those were definitely inputs into the broader vulnerability assessment. But what we often want to know is where are areas of high vulnerability where more people live, because not all the things that might lead to a place being vulnerable are population-based. So on the right-hand side, we have a map that shows both vulnerability and population density in one image, and I'll walk you through this. The areas that are more pink are those that are higher vulnerability and
áreas que están más altas de vulnerabilidad.
And then the areas that are more teal are higher density and lower vulnerability. And then the areas that are darkest and darkest purple are those that have the most relative vulnerability and relative population density. So again, this is really a tool to peel back the onion. And when we see these areas pop out as more vulnerable, in the web tool and in our analysis, you can click around and see, you know, what are the different attributes that comprise the index and why might an area be popping out as higher vulnerability. And this was an input into much of the rest of the vulnerability assessment. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Lisa to talk about sort of how we incorporate these results into the rest of the assessment.
Thank you, Ben. So we'll move from the index to the other part of the vulnerability assessment. In the Commerce Guidebook that came out in the spring, asked each community that was pursuing this element to look at its comprehensive plan and its policies and strategies around 11 different sectors. So it ranged from food systems to buildings to economic development, ecosystems, transportation, water resources, and a wide variety of topics. So we screened all the policies through those different sectors. And then on the next slide is just sort of our overall process to look at all the comprehensive plan policies, also your natural hazard plan, your shoreline master program, your climate action strategy, and look for opportunities to strengthen or weave those into the comprehensive plan where we saw some potential gaps. One of the key strategies is to look at efforts that could help with both adaptation as well as greenhouse gas mitigation. And in that diagram on the right, the green area are those kind of strategies that help both with greenhouse gas reduction and with adaptation. So tree canopy, green infrastructure, building retrofits around energy and things like that are sort of the sweet spot of strategies. So we took a look at that. We did also take this to the advisory committee and hear from the public at that meeting that there's a lot of interest in the strategies, and in particular around extreme heat and smoke at that session, and ideas for resilience hubs and how to get that information out to the community. So I'll pause there, see if there's any questions for us before we move on.
Any questions? Councilmember Sarah?
Yeah, I'm looking at the air indicator list of sensitivities and wondering if the airport fits into that in any way. It correlates to a lot of the health issues on here, but it's not actually pulled out anywhere, and I'm curious if it should be or has been considered.
The city is considering the airport in the overall planning effort and environmental justice issues. We don't have it identified as a specific indicator list. I can let Ben speak to that. Some communities do look at proximity to major roadways, for example, as increasing sensitivity, but a lot of these other indicators overlap. So people with asthma, with other health conditions that are listed under sensitivity or adaptive capacity. So we're kind of counting it in terms of health. But Ben, maybe you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I would echo what Lisa said, that yes, it's not considered directly as a sensitivity. That would be an interesting thing to include. I would say that, you know, the proxy of the community health attributes that we did include, as well as proximity to heavy traffic metric, while not, you know, the direct impact of air travel, the proximity to heavy traffic going to and from the airport is considered in that metric.
Other questions? I just want to note that we're behind
Okay.
about 20 minutes overall. So if
We can fly through the rest of this pretty quick. So just on the next slide, we've summarize the values and vision that we've been working with the community and the advisory committee on. So we have overall values that would go across elements, and then we have a guiding vision and vision statements for each element of the plan. And then if we go into the next slide, we have alternatives. As Susan mentioned, we're going to be testing different options, test ideas about the future and how to meet the regional commitments. If we go to the next slide, where we got ideas about these alternatives from the various engagement efforts last fall and through the spring. Only a subset of those engagements are listed there. But we have considered a number of ideas that came from the community in these alternatives that we're testing in an environmental impact statement. If we go to the next slide, some of the bigger ideas, I think it might be one slide back, but some of the bigger ideas are around middle housing, neighborhood centers, and employment centers. There we go. Thank you. And so those have been woven into different alternatives as well. Those alternatives on the next slide use a number of land use categories that get at the urban center intensity, commercial and mixed use areas. And then those different types of residential, including the missing middle, as well as multifamily and industrial and parks and schools areas. And so those have been combined in different ways into alternatives. So in addition to studying today's zoning, which we call the no action, we have two other alternatives. And so on the next slide, we have what we're calling alternative 2, one more after that. This one is focusing growth in different neighborhood center nodes, largely around corridors where there's transit or will be transit. And the other alternative we call alternative 3, greater downtown. And this one is to expand the intensity within downtown and along First Avenue, as well as to expand some of the industrial areas to achieve jobs. So both alternatives meet those housing targets. We've done some testing around the affordability. Alternative 3 is the one that meets the job target in Burien. So I think our final slide is on our next steps on what we're doing here. So the draft plan sharing followed by legislative review. I think Susan, you might have some other.
So if anybody has, would be, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so we'll be looking at issuing asking for public comment on a draft plan and the EIS environmental impact statement alternatives. We can later on this fall, we'll be holding some meetings and describing what those words actually mean. And then we'll be moving through a process of working with the Planning Commission and working with council members in 2024 to finalize the plan. So it'll be a big next half year to 9 months. And then we'll be able to move forward on some of the zoning issues that we talked about tonight. So we'd be open to questions or comments if we have time. Totally understand if there is not enough time.
Any other questions before we move on to Councilmember Mora?
I was wondering, do we have the infrastructure in place for the domestic housing growth, like utilities?
That is part of what we are evaluating in the environmental impact statement is where is their capacity or where would there need to be improvements? Thinking of this as a 20-year plan and that the growth will take some time.
Thanks. Deputy Mayor.
One of the things that I hear from some of the builders I've spoken with is concerns with Seattle City Light and the cost of using Seattle City Light versus Puget Sound Energy. So will that be a conversation for the future of Burien, whether or not we stick with Seattle City Light or we switch to PSE?
I can't speak to the district boundaries or service boundaries, but that has come up as a comment in the developer interviews. And Susan, I think you've had some conversations, or we will be having some conversations.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of purview Burien has over Seattle City Light and Puget Sound Energy, but we've heard those same kinds of concerns from developers. So I don't really have an answer, but we'll look into it.
Okay, something to talk about. And
Thank
thank you
you.
for all this. Thank you for all this.